Hi, everybody. This is the Psychology of Human Sexuality, and today we're going to be talking about response as well as arousal and other parts of the process of engaging in sexual behavior at a physical level. We'll be talking about the responses of our senses and some interesting information. Hope you enjoy it. So the first thing I want to say is, as always, pull out your PowerPoint and look at that as we move through here in this section. It'll be interesting but also very useful to do so because there are some anatomical terms which we have talked about before, which now will be discussed in the context of arousal and response. So be sure you have that in front of you. It'll be much easier to follow the things that I say. Okay? All right. So the first thing to note is that we'll be taking the senses one by one, and the first one we'll talk about is the sense of sight. So humans are primates. We're higher primates. That gives you any solace. And so we are more oriented to sight than to smell. Unlike other mammals, dogs are much more oriented to smell than we are. And so visual cues dominate attraction initially. And we know that men are more visually oriented and rewarded than women when it comes to sexual arousal. And men are actually more likely to enjoy actual or imagined explicit imagery that is of a sexual nature than women are. But there's quite an overlap there. Women do respond to visual cues, including explicit imagery, even if they're not aware of it, the research tells us, but not as easily, as quickly, or as fully as men are. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about smell. So natural odors probably play a bigger role than we might be conscious of, and so think about a time 100,000 years ago. Up to about 50,000 years ago, when you didn't have the same emphasis on the spoken word. Think about that time being one wherein no one wore any perfumes or colognes, and we didn't have soap. So smell was probably more important. We also know that in decoding the human genome in the 80s that we actually have the genes that would be responsible for receiving and identifying smells very much like animals closer to the ground, like dogs, can, but that those genes have been turned off through evolution because they really aren't necessary now that we walk upright. And so we have those genes. Imagine what it would be like to smell as a dog does, if you would be able to turn on those genes. Well, so in modern humans, responses to odors are pretty much conditioned, and we are shaped by our cultural norms and trends. Westerners, for example, prefer cleanliness and odor masking perfumes and colognes, and Eastern nations may not be as conditioned. And the smells themselves and what those are strictly conditioned. If you blindfold a bunch of men, they will actually become more sexually aroused by sniffing the extracts of female copulins, which are pheromones, really, that come from what are called apocrine glands, than by expensive perfumes. How about that one? 80% of women who are dabbed on the lips with the extract of the perspiration of other women begin to synchronize their menstrual cycles after 2 or 3 months when they're in the presence of those other women geographically. That is very interesting, and I think most of us know there's a synchronicity of either of the females who are living in the same household after a few months. We also know that, this is just interesting research data, that long and short menstrual cycling females become regularized / normalized after exposure to male underarm extract. Male underarm extract creates a relaxation response in females. So we know pheromones exist, but to what extent we currently respond to these is still being researched. And of course, as you might imagine, perfume and cologne companies are desperately seeking ways to put such things in perfumes and colognes. That would be a boon to many things, including the diaper industry. Men are significantly more attracted to women during high fertility times due to copulins. This is very easily seen in research, including that by the University of New Mexico, in which they determined the position in the menstrual cycle of exotic dancers at men's clubs and measured the amount of tips that they got. And what was determined was that the closer that a dancer was to their high fertility time, the greater the tips that they got. And it was very significant in difference. And that women on birth control, that is to say, the hormone treatment, saw no peaks or dips in tips. Okay, so let's talk about touch. Well, it could be argued that because we're mammals, we have a need to rub up against each other for purposes of identification, in terms of smell, maybe, for hierarchy establishment. So other mammals, if you look at their behavior, do those things, and they scent mark, they reinforce familial connections, they have that hierarchy, and of course it generates pleasure to rub on another person. That is to say, it's relaxing to have someone else touch you affectionately, rubbing your shoulders and holding your hand and hugging you and so forth. We could look at it from the other direction too, that not touching generates, on average over time, a psychological dysregulation. And one can become lonely, can even become depressed, and so depressive disorders may follow. So from any direction you care to look, and even animal analogs, touch is a very significant issue. We could even say and discuss for a while, this is not the time for that, but say and discuss that we have a skin hunger. Despite the fact that there are now almost approaching 8 billion people on Earth, we don't touch each other very much for many reasons. So we have erogenous zones, and those are parts of the body that are particularly sensitive to tactile stimulation and, when touched, result in a sexual response of one degree or another. And there are two different kinds. There's primary and secondary. Primary are the ones that have lots of sensory nerve receptors, things like the genitals and the perineum and the inner thighs and breasts and so forth. They vary a bit from person to person, but they're pretty much the same. And then we have the secondary ones. Those are the ones that are eroticized through conditioning. Things like shoulders or ears or necks. Those could be any part of the body, really. So the way we look at this is to say, when someone is already sexually aroused, then the entire body is actually heightened in a response state, okay? And ready to respond to touch, to any area of the body. Okay. So another thing we could say is that our bodies are primed for sex at all times, which makes us very different than other animals. Most other animals, in fact, all but one or two, maybe a few more that we don't know about yet, that are postulated, but all other animals have to obey estrous cycles, so they don't really respond to sexual invitation by females unless the female is in a fertile period. And that that cycle is on, of course, for each animal on a different time scale. So we, although primed for sex at all times, are inhibited from responding due to cultural and social and situational expectations. So, interesting. What are the other animals? Well, the bonobo monkey is one. They are the closest relative we have. It's kind of a subspecies of chimpanzees. They have recreational sex. They kiss with open mouths and lips. They have male superior sex, and in all positions, really. And they solve their problems using sexuality as a way to reduce aggressive behaviors. So it's very interesting, very interesting. Well, so let's talk about taste now. And taste, we're on slide 20. Most scientists really downplay the role that taste plays. They contend that taste plays a minor role. Responsiveness is quite variable from person to person. Some people are very aroused by the smell of their partner, their genital secretions, underarm smell or taste, skin taste. Of course, taste and smell are very intimately linked. If you lose your sense of smell because you have a cold, or then you won't taste as easily, and so on. It is claimed that some people can determine the compatibility of a mate by a single deep kiss. Is that smell or taste? We're not sure. When you kiss someone, all your senses are engaged: touch, sight, hearing, smell, taste. Yeah. It could be that females kissing a male are receiving his testosterone. That could be. And now let's talk about listening or hearing. Sounds, including songs, can be turn-ons or turn-offs that are conditioned. So what we think is that for much of the conditioning that goes on, it occurs when someone is highly aroused. There may be ambient noise or sounds that are occurring, either from the other person or in song, but maybe a song is on the stereo. Is that an old word, stereo? Okay. And then that you make the association. It's a conditioned response then. But we also know there's some biology here too, because women's voices are consistently rated by males as more alluring during high fertility times. Men can detect a slightly higher pitch in the female's voices, which occurs only when she is in a high fertility cycle. And to turn that around, men with deeper voices are considered more appealing. Now, deeper voices are the result of larger amounts of testosterone, which has to do with genetics. Certain words, certain sounds are then conditioned to be sexually excited, partly from biology and partly from association. Now, let's talk a little bit about aphrodisiacs. Aphrodisiacs, if you look at the broadest definition of them, are substances that increase either desire or response. If you just talk about desire, there may only be a very few number of true aphrodisiacs. If you talk about response, there's more. So in terms of response, you can talk about natural products like yohimbine from the bark of an African tree. It has been shown experimentally to increase blood flow to the genitals. Now that's about response, not about desire. So too are the standard oral medications, things like Viagra, Levitra, Cialis. Those do not increase desire. That's a misunderstanding. They don't make you want to have sex. The connection may be, though, that if you are responding, say male is achieving an erection where he could not before, he's going to want to be sexual. So, but technically speaking, they don't affect desire. Amyl nitrate, also known as poppers, dilate blood vessels and produce sensations of warmth. That's a mild response substance. Okay. So one has to be careful how one describes what an aphrodisiac really is. Now, amphetamines, let's say methamphetamine, does seem to increase drive, desire, and response, at least in the beginning stages of abuse of that drug. And all use of that is abuse, I guess, because it's not used in almost no ways for medical reasons, maybe rarely. But anyway, in the beginning stages of use of that drug, it does appear to affect both. Over time, though, it can obliterate response and drive. But here's the main point. Okay, here's the ultimate main point. Nothing offers better promotion of sexual desire and response than to be in good physical condition, to get good sleep, to be emotionally well, and to be in a loving relationship. Or maybe a new one. But this is true. Medications can and maybe ought to be used when there is a significant physical limitation in the way that, say, Viagra does for males with issues. But even men with ED, erectile dysfunction, who would benefit from, say, Viagra or other medications, might do just as well if they got in good shape and lost weight and got them control of their type 2 diabetes and so forth and so on. So this is a tricky area when you say, well, I have to have the medication, and it's not true that if I'm in, so it's best to try the other things first. In fact, when we're thinking about the treatment of sexual dysfunction, we want to exert as much influence as we can in the treatment of individuals to include for them the ideas that this is true, that being in good emotional, physical condition is really great. Getting good sleep is really great. Being in a good relationship is really great. And all of that is part of treatment, potentially, you see. Let's talk about the opposite of aphrodisiacs, which are anaphrodisiacs. So anaphrodisiacs are things that inhibit desire and or response in a broad definition. So one of these is alcohol, which disinhibits at first with low doses, so that can actually make you more flirty and talkative and so forth. But after just a minimal amount of alcohol, it then becomes really an aphrodisiac. It decreases desire. It decreases the ability to function sexually. It may create a lack of orgasmic potential, erection, and so forth. Some blood pressure medications can do these things. Some antidepressants, like many SSRIs, the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors like Prozac, can. That's a side effect that has to be monitored. Another overriding sort of idea here is that the use of almost any psychoactive drug eventually leads to sexual difficulties and maybe sexual dysfunctions. Yeah. So now let's talk now about sexual response models. And the two or three I want to talk about. First one is the one we will follow most closely, and that's the Masters and Johnson, sometimes called the Masters and Johnson 4-phase linear model, which considers biology only. Okay? And if you consider biology only in sexual response, and you follow their model, you see that there's an excitement phase, a plateau phase, so excitement phase, plateau phase, orgasmic phase, and then a resolution. And it's a little different for males and females. It is different. Okay? So if you look at a graph, and you will see this on page 32 of the PowerPoint, you will see that you'll see curves drawn for both males and females. But if you go to if you go and just look at The light blue color, that's a female curve, which includes the possibility of a second or more orgasms after the plateau stage. If you look at the male, you can see that the male one is straight up and then straight down into a resolution phase. So immediate excitation, almost no plateau stage, and then resolution after orgasm. Okay? You also see another curve, sort of in between the gray and the light blue, a sort of a greenish blue in the middle there. That's a female, often a female curve, and this is a excitement phase that for both males and females are roughly the same. And then you see a long plateau that never reaches orgasmic levels, and then a slow resolution. Okay? Males are more likely to orgasm during sexual activity than females are. We'll talk about that later. Okay, another version of the response cycle is offered by Kaplan. She died some years ago. It's a triphasic model, and this considers mostly biology, but a little bit of psychology. So the first is desire, this desire stage. She talks about this both biologically and psychologically. Then an excitement phase, and then an orgasm phase. And she doesn't really talk about the resolution. Okay. I developed a response cycle, which you will not be tested over if you want to look at it. It's on page 34. It considers primarily psychological and relational issues, but it's underlain by physical processes. Okay. Another one is the Bassam cyclical model. So Bassam is a female researcher and practitioner in this area of psychology. And so hers is an intimacy-based model of female sexual response. And so she has it in a cycle in which there can be spontaneous sexual drive in any one of a number of parts of the cycle, and that arousal and desire can create emotional and or physical satisfaction, which then creates emotional intimacy, which then can be in and of itself a sexual stimulation, which then moves to arousal once again. So this is a very unique and useful way to see female sexual response. The female sexual response is much more likely to be some kind of cyclical process, and it is more difficult to see the male process as a cyclical process. I'm working on one now, but it doesn't look fruitful at this moment. We'll see later. Anyway, I won't test you over my cycle, but I might ask you questions about the others. Okay, so let's talk about desire now specifically. Desire is a very complex interaction between neural systems, in other words, neural packages within the brain in various places, hormones, their distribution, the timing of their release, and the degree of release, the situation one is in, which is bounded by a number of things, much of which is reciprocal in nature, but also bounded by cultural, social, and individual norms and expectations. Stress levels. So high stress levels generally subdue sexual desire, as one could easily imagine. Not always, but usually. An exception, as one example, would be that some people, when they're in intense states of grieving, become more sexual. They wish to be sexual as a comforting thing, or as a way to be distracted from their grief. But sexual desire is also contingent upon the condition of the relationship you're in. Whether you are not in a relationship and you meet someone you don't know, and it's for the purposes of it being novel, because it's novel, it can be more exciting than in a long-term relationship otherwise, but or it could be in the context of a loving relationship. Okay. And then the last thing is a level of self-acceptance. So sexual desire is contingent upon that. So people who have self-esteem issues are likely to be less desirous of sex. They feel more vulnerable and less acceptable. They may have poor body image, and that can subdue their interest in being sexual, because that's a vulnerable thing to do with someone, is to be naked. So, okay. So, the desire for sexual activity can vary significantly in a day, across hours, even across minutes, quite frankly. So let's talk specifically about what happens. I have talked about, when we talked about in the last section about anatomy and physiology, we talked about aspects of arousal. We've talked about the terms, the anatomical terms. So now I want to get a little more specific and informative about this, okay? So we're going to use Masters and Johnson 4-phase linear model, okay? So in the excitement or arousal phase, the uterus elevates, the bladder and pubic bone are not changing yet. The clitoris enlarges, the vagina lubricates, and the inner labia, also known as the labia minora, swell. Okay. In the plateau phase, the uterus elevates, and the inner 2/3 of the vagina expand and lengthen. Okay? The outer third begins to form what we call the orgasmic platform. So the musculature begins to tighten. That's called myotonia. The clitoris retracts under the prepuce, the clitoral hood, and that is a sign that orgasm is imminent. During the orgasm phase in females, the uterus begins to contract. The muscles of the uterus are then literally contracting, okay? And this is part of the great feeling of that orgasm. The platform itself contracts. In other words, the outer third musculature of the vaginal barrel begins to pulsate, contract. And the rectal sphincter contracts involuntarily. And that all those contractions, both in males and females during orgasm, occurs at 0.8 seconds in between the first, second, and maybe third contraction. Okay? Now, the blood filling the clitoris and the labia and so on is called vasocongestion. They are filling and congesting vessels within those tissues. Vaso means blood vessel. Myotonia refers to the tightening of muscles. Myo refers to muscle. So when the vagina lubricates, it's within 10 to 30 seconds, with a very small amount usually, but that varies. The labia majora flatten and spread, and the labia minora enlarge. The vaginal walls will begin to thicken. Okay, I've talked about just about everything else except a couple more things, which include the nipples becoming erect and enlarged, and the breasts themselves often enlarge a little bit. About 1/2 to 3/4 of women have a sex flush, which is the reddening of face and upper chest usually. Okay. In the plateau phase, there's more myotonia and vasocongestion. The uterus is fully elevated. As we talked about, the clitoris retracts. Sex flush can be even more apparent. Again, the face and the chest. And the labia minora in females may become very, very dark, almost purplish. That's called the sex skin. In males, it's the glans penis that becomes purplish. Heart rate elevates, can go as high as 150. And as orgasm occurs, the extremity spasm, there is invariably some kind of grimacing of the face, and so on. Um, what is an orgasm? Well, I can tell you only what it is biologically. We've covered that, but I can tell you that typical descriptions include a full body release, a series of pleasurable muscle spasms and contractions. Some people say it's a loss of sense of the outer world. Some people say it's a time when they don't worry about what they look like or where their body is and their partner's body is, those sorts of things, you know. Some women have been known to cry or laugh or sneeze or scream or moan. Some fall asleep. Yes, some do. Some are completely silent. So there's a great variability in the subjective experience of orgasm. Biologically, it's the same from female to female, but subjectively, it can be quite different. Hmm? Um, so, uh, some people say, you know, if you're uncertain as to whether you've had an orgasm, that means you haven't. I think that's probably true. It's generally described as a fairly intense experience among females and males, but I suspect there are some females who have some kind of nerve damage that isn't enough to stop an orgasm, to interrupt the creation of an orgasm, but is enough to subdue the experience of an orgasm. I am not knowledgeable about what that might be, but I suspect that's the case. Now, if we talk about evolution, we would want to know what is the purpose of the female orgasm. Well, a couple of things have been proposed. One is that if a female has an orgasm, that may be an indicator of a male who cares about the female, which is then more likely to create a bonding experience, a mutuality experience. Some say, well, we can watch the cervix dip into what would be potentially a pool of semen deposited by a male, which makes it more likely to, and the technical word here, believe it or not, is upsucking the semen into the uterus to then create a higher likelihood of there being a fertilized egg. Do all women have orgasms? No. Some percentage of 10 or 15% of women have never had one. Can they have one if they are significantly stimulated? Probably, but not all of them, for a variety of reasons. Can orgasm be achieved by intercourse alone? Maybe, depending on the position. Woman superior leaning far forward? Maybe. And some females are naturally innervated such that they can with intercourse and